so David and John were the same caliber of men, piety, courage, but they were pioneers. They were looking beyond just pastoring in the colonies and being comfortable. They had a mission heart.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you doing today?
Jonathan, I'm well, and I'm very interested in the conversation we're going to have.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm interested in the conversation. This is a book that we want to commend to our listeners. We'll just say that at the outset, but also a guest whom I account as just a dear friend and brother. I wish I saw him more. Mack Tomlinson serves as a pastor at Providence Chapel in Denton, Texas. I whenever I go there and I leave, I feel like I'm leaving a home away from home. Love the brothers down there. And so Mack's written a book recently called The Indomitable Brainerds, The Gospel Legacy of David and John Brainerd's Mission to the Indians. And Mack, thanks for your willingness to join us today.
Thank you very much.
So we want to highlight particularly the account that you've given here, not so much of David Brainerd. Our listeners may be familiar with David Brainerd. His diaries were, of course, widely available and publicized after his death through the work of Jonathan Edwards. I believe I'm right in saying it's Jonathan Edwards' bestseller. But so David Brainerd is known, but you're trying to tell the story not just of David Brainerd, but of John Brainerd. So give us a little outline of what David Brainerd did, and then what the Lord used John Brainerd to do.
Yeah, of course, they were both born in the first 2 decades of the 18th century, and both went to Yale. John was 2 years younger, and after David was expulsed from Yale for a very minor offense, he didn't know what to do. So ultimately, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge in Scotland, which by this time even had an office, I think, in New York City, they sent John to follow up with David as the missionary among the colonial Indians. David had gone for 3 years, brief time, and died of tuberculosis at 28. And so John was sent to replace him. And this is where the story is forgotten. People remember David because of Edwards' publication of his journal and diary, which kind of went viral in that day. But John is forgotten. And so the more I read his life, when I was in Britain years ago, I realized John is an unknown Brainerd, and this story needs to be told. So John stayed among the Indians for 35 years after David died among them, or died at the end of his 3-year mission career. So yeah, it's a fitting thing to let their work be seen together over those decades.
So David, as you said, is so well known because of his diary and journals published by Edwards. And he had such, he suffered greatly and that suffering comes through and the Lord's sustaining of him in the midst of his suffering is a profound example. But how would you contrast, as best we can tell, John Brainerd's, even his demeanor, his gifts, as opposed to David's? He stayed 10 times as long among the Indians, and so in a sense, he was the one used to really establish the church there. But what else? How else would you distinguish these two besides the fact that one is well known and the other is virtually unknown?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, they were very close friends as brothers growing up, and the more they went into manhood, the closer friends they became. And so when David leaves for Yale, John is left at home and they write letters. And then David goes to the Indians. John later, after he graduated Yale, went to visit David several times. And the evidence is John had the same godliness and the same depth of theological equipping. Of course, when you graduate from Yale in those days, you can read Latin fluently, you can read the Greek New Testament. So David and John were the same caliber of men, piety, courage, but they were pioneers. They were looking beyond just pastoring in the colonies and being comfortable. They had a mission heart. And so John had the same kind. And as you pointed out, he stayed 10 times longer. So he had this, he did not suffer from the depression that David did. He was more level and balanced, though he faced it, discouragement deeply because of normally external circumstances. David never married. John outlived his first wife, remarried a godly woman of Puritan stock in the colonies, and then she outlived him. So that would be pretty much a side-by-side comparison. But, you know, it's like Jim Elliot and Bert Elliot in South America. Jim Elliot dies as a martyr and goes down as a shooting star and is famous. People don't know that his brother Bert Elliot stayed for 6 decades planting churches in South America. And so the well-known one is remembered, the lesser-known one is forgotten. And so John shouldn't be forgotten. He was on equal standing with David in many ways. Is that too long-winded of an answer?
No, that's helpful. I think that's the question is, you know, in some ways in God's providence, again, David and the Lord used David Brainerd's death in powerful ways to inspire others to missionary service. So it's not that he didn't, wasn't used by the Lord powerfully, but when we talk about what we're looking for in even in mission work, what John did was quite remarkable in the length of time he spent there.
Well, it was, and I'll give just a brief reply. You know, what makes it remarkable is that in the colonies, of course, this was before the Revolution, and later John actually became a chaplain in the Revolution, though he died before the end of the war. But we have to remember in the colonies, everything was so different. It was British. It wasn't American culture. It wasn't American layout of things. It wasn't a democracy. So you had these long distances. The Brainerds would have to ride their horses, you know, from New Haven, Connecticut to Long Island or to Pennsylvania. So it was a savage wilderness. There were Indians everywhere. And you traveled alone. And even by this time, the Indian tribes hated the white men because of the evil traders that corrupted them and cheated them. So for a white young man to ride into Indian tribes in the wilderness uninvited, it just shows the height of courage and commitment that both David and John exemplified.
Mack, I was going to ask about some of the peculiar challenges of ministry to the Indians that John Brainerd faced. Some of these you outline in some very interesting appendices at the end of your volume. The difficulty of preaching to them. One, of course, the prejudice, maybe some of it well-founded because of the mistreatment of others who'd come in before. How did John Brainerd address these prejudices against himself as white, trying to come in and speak the gospel to these Indians?
Yeah. Well, both Brainerds overcame the prejudice of the Indians by their example and their kindness and their humility and their love. Different ones of them were present with Indians in a group of Indians, and some of those Indians wanted to kill them immediately, and then God always gave favor and preserved them. Someone would argue against it, and they would be spared. So overcoming the obstacles, of course, the language was always a challenge because the different tribes they traveled to would have a different Indian dialect. So although both men learned to converse in languages, I think that they were around the longest. David was with 3 different tribes over 3 different periods of 12 months each. So he couldn't master language, but they were dependent on translators who were honest enough to translate accurately. But I think the language barrier, and then of course the Indians back in those centuries, they were worshipped ancestors. They worshipped demons in their spiritualism. They were also as vile morally as could be imagined. They were such pagans that their concept of God was completely pagan and Hindu somewhat. So the Brainers just had to start from the ground up of who is God, who is man, man's sin, the fall, and tell biblical stories, sometimes chronologically. But the biggest explanation is God gave those men favor with the Indians wherever they went. They were never killed, whether it were 3 years or into a 4th decade. I think the other challenges were just the travel in winter in the snow. You sleep on the ground under a bearskin. And so just the strenuousness of going, and always the stress and danger. There was never relief from the stress and danger of potential death, or oftentimes they lacked food. And the Indians would give them bread that was already molded early on. So, brother, I would just say the difficulties of communicating the gospel to the Indians were just so numerous. And it became harder toward the end of John's ministry because the Indians were relocated by the colony governors regularly and unjustly sometimes. So they were on the move. And when that's the case, it's hard to reestablish, it's hard to have a continuity of things. But John, he excelled with longevity. He became a trustee of the newly found Princeton College later, even though he was a Yale graduate. He was awarded by the governors of the colonies proper things for his famous work among the Indians. And even historians in the next 100 years after the Brainerd's death, secular historians said the Brainerd Indian Mission did more for the colonial North American Indians than anyone in history. So the significance and the impact and the legacy lasted a long time.
Mack, that was one of the things that James and I were remarking on actually before you came on here. Just in our reading of the book, it's hard to imagine moving between the two worlds that John was moving between constantly. He would go, as a trustee of Princeton. He was awarded, given these commendations by the governor. He was in that element of society, and then just 50 miles away, he'd ride back and be among the Indians. It's hard to imagine a man who could move between those two worlds with such humility and continue to persevere in the work that the Lord had given him to do.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, my view is David or John could have been a seminary professor. They had the gifts to pastor any church in the New World at that time, but theirs was a deliberate choice to take the gospel to those who did not know it.
One of the things too that struck me is just the story, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about it, how the legacy of John Brainerd was preserved, because from your telling of it, there was just a very brief mention made of him later on that kind of took you down the path of studying John Brainerd. I mean, it's almost remarkable that this book was able to be written.
Well, it was completely providential, Jonathan. And in the library, I saw on the shelf one afternoon, The Life of John Brainerd, and it caught my attention. I wondered, could he be related to David? And it turned out he was his brother. I had never heard of him, though I was very familiar with David's life. So I read that biography. I said, this indeed is the rest of the story. The Christian world, the evangelical world, doesn't know about John. He's forgotten. So I wrote 2 articles for the Banner of Truth magazine on John over those years. And then finally I said, this story needs to be fully told. So I could only find the Life of John Brainerd on an academic reprint. So I got that and I went to work. And so the more I studied it, the more I looked at it, the more I saw the clear picture, I was more convinced, that the church needs to know of this story of the Brainerd legacy.
It's a good reminder too, isn't it, of how many men the Lord has used in history who are, from a human perspective, and this the Bible tells us to expect this from a human perspective, are forgotten, and yet if you could see how the Lord worked through them, it's really a remarkable story and a remarkably encouraging story. So I'm wondering, Mack, for you, as you spent time with John Brainerd and with the Brainerd brothers, what were some lessons that the Lord impressed upon you? What were your takeaways from this study?
Yes, well, it's a challenging question. You mentioned about John traveling between those 2 worlds that were so different. He could have had the comfortable world of notoriety and position and a New England church that would have made him more famous. But the Brainerds were driven by principles of faithfulness to God, of laboring away when no one sees, of living in the mundane, even if it's a hard circumstance, out of your obedience to Christ and his calling, and their courage in private times, their integrity in private times, their both of them keeping up their daily devotions in their cabins and being faithful. Just the faithfulness and the courage to plod along in the gospel ministry. Those were the lessons to me, their humility, their godliness, just their faithfulness. It was a rebuke to my life. And so those were my takeaways, Jonathan, in essence.
Well, we're grateful for your work. I'm personally grateful for your friendship and for your labors at the church and for your labors as a writer too. And this volume in particular, we would commend to our readers. And Mack, thanks so much for taking time to come on with us today.
Thank you, brothers, very much. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you.